When Dr. James Morrison walked into St. Catherine's Hospital at 6:15 a.m. on his first official day as Chief of Staff, he didn't announce himself. No press release, no welcome committee. Just a simple navy blue scrub top, black pants, and a stethoscope around his neck. He wanted to see how the hospital really operated when no one knew the boss was watching. He moved through the main corridor quietly, observing. Nurses hustled between rooms. Residents scribbled notes on clipboards. The morning shift was in full swing, and no one gave him a second glance. That was exactly what he wanted. James had spent 22 years working his way up through the medical system. Johns Hopkins for undergraduate, Stanford Medical School, residency at Massachusetts General, chief resident at Penn. And now, at 48 years old, he was the chief of staff at one of the largest hospitals in Virginia. But none of that mattered if the staff treated patients, and each other, poorly when they thought no one was watching. He rounded the corner into the emergency department. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. A young black woman sat in the waiting area, clutching her side and wincing. Her mother sat beside her, whispering reassurances. James noticed they'd been waiting a while. The intake timestamp on the board read 5:47 a.m. Over 30 minutes and still no triage. He approached the nurses' station. A white woman in her mid-40s with blonde hair pulled into a tight bun stood behind the counter, typing into a computer. Her name tag read Carol Hendricks, RN. She didn't look up. "Excuse me," James said politely. "The patient in Bay 3, has she been triaged yet?" Carol's fingers paused. She glanced up, her eyes scanning James quickly. Her expression shifted. Subtle, but he saw it. Dismissive. She went back to typing. "I'm handling it," she said flatly. James waited. "She's been here over 30 minutes. If she's presenting with abdominal pain—" "Are you a doctor?" Carol interrupted, still not looking at him. "Yes." She finally looked up fully, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Then I'm sure you know that triage is nurse responsibility." "I'll get to her when I get to her." James kept his voice even. "I understand. I'm just concerned about the wait time given her symptoms." Carol exhaled sharply. "Look, I don't know what department you're from, but we have protocols here. If you're not assigned to this floor, you need to step back and let us do our jobs." A younger nurse nearby glanced over, her eyes widening slightly. She seemed to recognize something in James's calm composure, but she stayed quiet. James nodded slowly. "Understood. I'll observe." He stepped back but didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the wall near the supply closet, arms folded, watching. Carol shot him an irritated glance, then returned to her computer. 10 more minutes passed. The young woman in the waiting area was now doubled over, her mother frantically waving toward the nurse's station. James straightened. This wasn't observation anymore. This was negligence. He walked back to the counter. "That patient needs to be seen now. Her symptoms are escalating." Carol spun around, her patience clearly gone. "I said I'm handling it, and unless you're on staff here, you need to leave this area." "I am on staff." "Then show me your badge." James reached into his pocket and pulled out his hospital ID. He held it up calmly. Carol squinted at it, then her face went pale. "Dr. James Morrison, Chief of Staff." Her mouth opened slightly. No words came out. The younger nurse behind her audibly gasped. James's voice remained steady, but his tone had changed. "Now, get that patient into a room. Run a CBC, metabolic panel and ultrasound. And if I find out you've been triaging based on anything other than medical need, we're going to have a much longer conversation." Carol stammered, I didn't know." "That's the problem," James said quietly. "You didn't know who I was. But that patient's care shouldn't depend on who's watching." He turned and walked toward the patient himself, kneeling beside her. "I'm Dr. Morrison. We're going to take care of you right now." Within minutes, the young woman was in an exam room. Within an hour, she was in surgery for a ruptured appendix. If they'd waited another 30 minutes, it could have been fatal. And Carol Hendricks was now sitting in James's office, about to learn exactly what accountability looked like. James sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Carol sat across from him, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was red, her jaw clenched. The confidence she'd had at the nurse's station was gone. "Do you know why you're here?" James asked, his tone measured. Carol's voice was stiff. "Because I didn't recognize you." "No," James said, leaning forward slightly. "You're here because you delayed care for a patient who was in critical condition, and I need to understand why." She shifted uncomfortably. "I was prioritizing—" "Prioritizing what?" James interrupted gently. "Because from where I stood, that young woman had been waiting over 40 minutes with clear signs of acute abdominal distress. What was more important than that?" Carol hesitated. "We were short-staffed. I had multiple patients. There were 3 nurses at that station," James said, "and 2 of them were standing idle while you typed. So, let me ask again, why wasn't she triaged?" Silence. James pulled up a file on his computer and turned the screen toward her. "This is your triage log from the last 6 months. I pulled it this morning." Carol's eyes widened. "Patients of color in this ER wait an average of 40% longer for initial triage than white patients. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern." Her face flushed. "That's not?" "It is," James said firmly. "And today, that pattern almost killed someone." Carol's hands trembled. "I've been a nurse here for 18 years. You've never been held accountable," James finished. "But that changes today." He closed the file and folded his hands. "You're suspended pending a full review. You'll attend mandatory bias training. And if I find any other cases where you delayed care based on race, you're done here." Carol stood abruptly. "This is unfair. You're making me a scapegoat because you're—" She stopped herself. James's expression didn't change. "Because I'm what?" She didn't answer. "Go home, Carol. We'll be in touch." She left without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. James sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't the first time he'd seen this, and it wouldn't be the last, but he'd spent his entire career proving he belonged in rooms where people assumed he didn't. Now he was in charge, and he wasn't going to let bias hide in the shadows anymore. Over the next week, James conducted unannounced rounds throughout the hospital. He reviewed patient wait times, treatment protocols, and staff interactions. What he found wasn't surprising, but it was damning. Black and Hispanic patients waited longer. They received less pain medication. Their concerns were dismissed more frequently, and it wasn't isolated to Carol, it was systemic. He called a mandatory meeting for all department heads. When he walked into the conference room, the tension was palpable. People knew why they were there. James didn't waste time. "We have a problem, and we're going to fix it." He pulled up data on the screen. Charts showing disparities in care, testimonials from patients who felt ignored, statistics that couldn't be explained away. "This isn't about individual bad actors," James said. "This is about a culture that's allowed bias to thrive. And starting today, that culture changes." He introduced new protocols: mandatory bias training, patient advocate positions, third-party reviews of triage decisions, and consequences for staff who violated the new standards. Some department heads nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable. One older doctor in the back folded his arms and muttered, "Political correctness gone mad." James heard him. He walked over slowly, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't political. It's medical. If you can't provide equal care to all patients, you don't belong in this hospital." The room went silent. Over the following months, the changes took root. Some staff embraced them. Others resisted. A few resigned. But slowly, the data began to shift. Wait times equalized. Patient satisfaction scores rose. Complaints about discriminatory treatment dropped. James knew it wasn't perfect. Changing a culture took time. But for the first time in years, he felt like the system was moving in the right direction. And it all started because one nurse made the mistake of assuming she knew who he was and what he was worth, based on the color of his skin. 6 months after James took over as Chief of Staff, St. Catherine's Hospital was selected for a surprise inspection by the Joint Commission. the organization that accredits hospitals nationwide. It was the kind of review that could make or break a hospital's reputation. James knew they were ready. The changes he'd implemented weren't just for show, they were structural, embedded into the hospital's daily operations. But he also knew that old habits died hard, and some staff still resented the new protocols. On the day of the inspection, James walked the floors with the review team. They observed triage procedures, interviewed patients, and reviewed medical records. Everything went smoothly until they reached the ICU. An elderly black man lay in bed, his daughter sitting beside him, visibly distressed. The lead inspector approached her. "Ma'am, can I ask about your father's care?" She hesitated, glancing at James, then back at the inspector. "He's been here 3 days. He keeps saying he's in pain, but the nurses keep telling him to tough it out. They say he's exaggerating." James's jaw tightened. He pulled the patient's chart immediately. The pain medication orders were minimal, far below what was appropriate for someone recovering from major surgery. He turned to the attending physician, a white man in his late 50s. "Dr. Brennan, can you explain this?" Dr. Brennan glanced at the chart and shrugged. Patient reported pain, but vitals were stable. Didn't seem necessary to escalate. "Didn't seem necessary?" James repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "He's post-op day 3 from a bowel resection. Pain management is standard protocol. I used my clinical judgment. Your judgment is wrong." James turned to the nurse on duty. "Increases pain medication per protocol. Now." He looked back at Dr. Brennan. "My office, after the inspection." The inspection team took notes. The lead inspector gave James a long look, then nodded slightly. Message received. That afternoon, Dr. Brennan sat in James's office, arms crossed defensively. "You embarrassed me in front of the inspection team," Brennan said. James didn't blink. "You undertreated a patient in pain. I corrected it. I've been practicing medicine for 30 years. Then you should know better." James pulled up another file. "This is the 4th time in 6 months you've undertreated pain in black patients." "It's not a coincidence." Brennan's face reddened. "That's absurd. It's documented." James turned the screen toward him. "Studies show that many doctors still believe black patients have a higher pain tolerance. It's a myth rooted in racism, and it's killing people." Brennan stood abruptly. "I don't have to listen to this." "Yes, you do," James said, his voice steady, "because I'm your chief of staff. And if you can't provide equal care, you don't belong here." Brennan stared at him, then turned and walked out, slamming the door. 3 weeks later, Dr. Brennan resigned. The hospital didn't mourn his departure, and the patients, especially the black and brown patients who'd been dismissed for years, finally started to feel heard. James knew he couldn't change every mind, but he could change the system, and sometimes that was enough. A year after James became chief of staff, St. Catherine's Hospital received national recognition for its improvements in healthcare equity. The story spread, not because James sought attention, but because the patients and staff who'd experienced the transformation shared it. A local news station reached out for an interview. James hesitated. He didn't want the spotlight, but his PR director convinced him, people need to see that change is possible. So he sat down for the interview, in the same navy scrubs he'd worn on his first day. The interviewer asked, "What made you push so hard for these changes?" James thought for a moment. "Because I've been on the other side." "I've been the patient who wasn't believed, the medical student who was assumed to be a janitor, the resident who had to work twice as hard to get half the respect." He paused. "And I realized that if I didn't use my position to fix this system, I'd be complicit in it." The interview aired that evening. Within days, it had millions of views. Medical schools started using it in their curricula. Hospitals across the country reached out, asking how St. Catherine's had done it. James didn't have all the answers, but he had one. You start by believing that everyone deserves dignity, and then you build a system that actually delivers it. Carol Hendricks, the nurse who dismissed him on his first day, watched the interview from her living room. She'd completed her bias training and had been reinstated, but on a probationary status. She was different now, quieter, more careful. She picked up her phone and texted James. "I'm sorry for everything. Thank you for not giving up on me." James read the message and smiled faintly. Change wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was just one person, learning to see others differently. And sometimes that was enough. If this story resonated with you, remember, bias in healthcare isn't just uncomfortable, it's deadly. Black patients are undertreated, dismissed, and ignored at rates that should horrify us all. But change is possible when people in power choose accountability over comfort. Share this story. Subscribe for more real-life moments that challenge us to do better. And if you work in healthcare or any system with power imbalances, ask yourself, who am I overlooking, and what am I going to do about it?